All right, welcome to part 3 of podcast 39. We're talking about Darwin's ideas, specifically natural selection, and we're picking up with this really important slide because it's got some really critical ideas about natural selection that you need to understand. We often we feel like we know what's natural selection saying, and you do, but there are certain ways you need to be able to express it in a test situation in order to appease the technical minded among your AP readers. So, the fundamental ideas behind natural selection are as follows. First of all, variation exists in populations, okay? In a population of finches, sorry. Not every finch is identical, and that's because they've got different genes. So that variation is inheritable, okay? So inherited variation exists in population of organisms. They're not all the same. That's critical. Organisms tend to produce more offspring than can survive, than the environment can support. And what that sets up is competition. These members of the same species are going to be competing for limited resources. And because they are varied, they are not identical, then some are going to be better at that competition than the others. It's just because some finches are going to have better characteristics. They're not all the same. So, because they're all the same and some are going to compete better than others, there is going to be a differential survival. In other words, some are going to survive, some aren't. And those that survive are going to have what you can think of as successful traits, or what we like to properly call adaptations, that help them survive. And that fundamentally is going to lead to differential reproduction, meaning some organisms in this species are going to have more babies than others, and those babies are going to inherit their good genes with those good adaptations. Okay? So, this is critical. Inherited variation, overproduction, competition, differential survival, but that's not near as critical as this differential reproduction. You gotta leave those babies behind with your good traits, and then they'll give them to their babies, and the next thing you know, over, I don't know, a few thousand years, got a new species. Okay? This is just there's no way all those millions of moss spores are going to make it. They're going to land very close to each other, and they're going to compete for resources. Some are going to compete better than others. Okay? These beetles, this is a great example of variation and competition. These are all the same species. They've got different color variants. And they're inheritable. Obviously, this beetle might have offspring that look very much like itself. This beetle might have offspring that look black. But whichever beetles have the best color variation to help them blend in with their environment are going to survive better. And they're going to pass, if they live in a bunch of black rock or something, this guy's probably going to do better than that guy. And over time, you'll see more and more of this guy than you will see of beetles looking like that. Because these guys get eaten, these guys don't. These guys get to have babies, these guys don't. Their babies inherit their black coloration, these guys. Okay? Now, artificial selection. Darwin looked at things like dogs. Like, I hope we've seen the video by now of dogs decoded. Artificial selection, breeding plants that we like, animals that we like, and hoping we get something we like even better when we breed organisms we've chosen together. He saw what a dramatic impact artificial selection could have in just the short time that humans have been doing this, relatively speaking. Humans have selected individuals as breeding stock that had really desirable traits for quite some time, many generations, but certainly not as long as the history of the earth exists. And as a result of this breeding activity, a lot of the time, the plants that we end up with growing as crops, or the animals we end up with as pets or as farm animals, don't look very much like what we originally started with. This is a mustard plant. These all came from the mustard plant. They look nothing like it, but that's where they came from. And it really took humans a fairly short amount of time to get all of these varieties of vegetables, of plants, from this one ancestral type of mustard plant. And that's because humans were choosing what they wanted and breeding it. Wolves gave rise to these, to those, and to that. How can that be? Because humans selected wolves that had certain traits that they liked. They were able to interact well with people. If you watch the video, if we haven't watched it yet when you're reading this, when you're watching this, watch it soon. They selected for traits they liked, and then it doesn't take all that long to start getting some really exaggerated body forms from that. Okay? Pigeons. This is your common pigeon, but has been bred to get all these crazy varieties. Okay? The raw genetic material is there. Humans just find it and exploit it by breeding these birds. There's another example. Now, Darwin didn't know anything about this because this really wasn't a problem at the time, but insecticide resistance. Same deal as antibiotic resistance in bacteria, really. If you spray your crops with some pesticide, you're going to have a whole bunch of bugs on those crops, maybe the bunch of the particular species that's causing your crops trouble, and most of them will be killed by that pesticide. Okay? But maybe there's some little dude here with a mutation that says, what do you know, I'm still living. They sprayed that pesticide all over me, but I don't care, I'm living. And so when these guys die, who's left behind? This guy. And he can restock the population. And now the next time we go to spray our pesticide on that population, guess what? Nobody dies because they are all descended from this small group of survivors, okay, that had the helpful gene. Same thing with bacteria, works the same way. That's why we have to be very careful with our antibiotics that we use if you get sick. You need to take the antibiotic properly so that you kill all the bacteria in you and don't leave some resistant strains that then won't be killed with an antibiotic. That's artificial selection. Ironically, when we try to kill insects with pesticides like this, we are actually selecting for insects that are resistant to the very pesticide we're using. Okay? So Darwin, after seeing all these examples of what humans had been able to do in such a short, relatively speaking, a few generations time frame, then he got to thinking, what could nature do over hundreds or thousands or millions of generations? Couldn't nature create enormously different organisms given all that time, if humans can create this much variety in this short a time? And so again, the importance of Lyell's work really does make itself evident here. This gradual accumulation of very small changes over eons of time, vast spans of time, Darwin argued really could account for this diversity of life on Earth. Because look what humans could do with diversity in breeding over such a short amount of time. So, some points that we should keep in mind at this point. I'm just kind of reminding you, remember that individuals do not evolve, populations do. That's the smallest unit that can actually evolve. Evolution can, remember what a population is. It's a group, a small group of a given species in a given area. So the population of squirrels at Monacan High School, that's a population. Okay. We'll talk about that bullet. Individuals cannot evolve. Okay, that's important. That is important. Okay, natural selection can only work with inheritable variation. Remember, no Lamarck. We can't go out and get a tattoo. We can't go stretch our neck and pass that on to our offspring. Okay? Now, this one we haven't talked about. Natural selection is situational. What might work in one environment really well may not work in another environment. So if you are rocking out in your one environment and that environment changes, you might get eliminated if you don't fit in. It is situational. What works today might not work tomorrow. Okay? All right. We've already talked about Darwin with his finches and the different food sources. There has been quite a bit of work done to kind of emphasize that what Darwin's ideas are essentially true. There are a type of finch, here he is, the medium ground finch on one of the Galapagos Islands, Daphne major, and they have really big, strong beaks, and they crack big, crushing seeds. They really like small seeds that are produced when it's wet. But in dry years, all seeds are relatively hard to come by. So in that case, finches have to eat both the small and the big seeds. And the larger seeds are kind of harder to deal with. They're harder to crush. So what scientists have observed that over the years, during a drought, the average beak size actually increases, not because an individual decides to grow a bigger beak, but because the individuals that survive happen to have big beaks, and they pass those on to their offspring. But the size of the beak will actually decrease again during wet years, because apparently the slightly smaller beak is better for dealing with the wet seeds that they prefer in the first place. Okay? So beak size is an inherited trait. Scientists attribute changes in beak size to, we just talked about that. We don't need that again. Okay? But it does help us to emphasize this point that it's situational. The big beak might be good at one point in time, but not so great in another. Okay. This is not inheritance of an acquired characteristic. The environment did not create the beaks. It was a genetic variation that created the beaks. Okay? And then natural selection acts on those beaks. If they don't work very well, you don't get to live. If they work really well, you do get to live and pass on your genes to your offspring. Okay. We are going to stop here, and we're going to talk about evidence for evolution. There is a pile of evidence to suggest that evolution occurs. So we're going to kind of leave Darwin and his idea of natural selection behind for a little bit and just talk about what evidence exists to support the idea that life has in fact changed over time. You can see the 5 major areas we can talk about here. And we will do that in the next podcast. All right, thanks a bunch. See you later.